Welcome back to part 2 of our Building Your First Fly Rod series, where we're showing you just how easy and affordable it is to build your own high-quality fly rods. And we're building a fly rod and raffling it off for charity. So let's take a look at some of the tools that we're going to need to build our first fly rod. I have before me one of the many commercially available rod wrapping jigs that are on the market. This one happens to be made by the Flex Coat company, but there are others available. Pac Bay makes some. We want to use relatively basic tools just to show you, how easy it is to get into building your own fly rods. So this rod wrapping jig has these adjustable uprights that are adjustable in and out. This gives you a lot of control over the rod wrapping process. Again, this is where you're wrapping thread around the guides on a fly rod to keep them in place in preparation for epoxying them in place. So this is a very, very handy tool. This is one of my favorites, actually. What I particularly like about this model is its method of providing thread tension. The spools of thread you place on these uprights, and then you run the thread through a little tool that sandwiches the thread so that that provides you some thread tension. There are other rod wrapping models on the market where they use a series of springs to put some pressure on the spool of thread itself. I really don't like those because when your thread is under tension, if you snip it, then you end up getting a little bit of a rat's nest back on the spool of thread. So that's why I like the method of sandwiching the thread in between a couple of tensioners here. So this is a really easy to use model, and it's also pretty affordable. You can find them just about everywhere when it comes to rod building supplies. Made by the same company is also a rod dryer. Now this just consists of an upright, which is nice because it happens to match the existing uprights. So when you're laying your entire rod out, you've got plenty of support for that rod. This drying motor essentially just rotates the rod at 7 revolutions per minute, and this is handy for when you've already placed epoxy on your fly rod and you're letting it dry. You want to keep that rotating constantly so that you don't end up with uneven globs of epoxy on your rod wraps. So this is the tool we'll be using. Very inexpensive. You can certainly spend a lot of money on the sport of rod wrapping, but it's not necessary to. So let's just move this out of the way for a minute. The other tools we'll be using, a very good chance you're going to have these in your shop already. First of all, a very coarse rat tail file. This is we're going to use this quite a bit, and we'll be using this for reaming out the inside diameter of the cork handle that we showed you earlier. If it's not fitting over the butt section of the rod blank, we can relieve some material from the inside of there so that we can rectify that. This is also sharp enough to actually ream out the wood reel seat if we need to do the same thing with the wood reel seat. A couple of flat files that are pretty fine, fine cutting files, and this is for actually dressing the metal rod guides. We want to make sure that they are free of burrs, and we want to tailor them so that when they go on the rod, they're lying nice and flat, and there's a smooth ramp for the thread to climb up on that guide foot as you're wrapping the thread around the rod. So we'll be using several files. In addition, we'll have some epoxies. This is some 5-minute epoxy for those things which we want to dry very quickly, such as when we're adhering the rod seat to the base section of the fly rod, and also the cork handle as well. This is a 2-part epoxy. With all 2-part epoxies, it's really critical that you get a good 50-50 mixture, and we'll discuss some of those techniques a bit later. In addition to the 5-minute epoxy, we have some slower drying epoxy that we actually use for wrapping the rod guides onto the rod. This will take quite a bit longer to dry, but it'll give us a nice, clear, hard finish if it's mixed and applied correctly. And again, we'll talk about those techniques as we get to that step in the process. This is color preservative. Now it's going to remind you of really watered down Elmer's glue. In many cases, I guess that's kind of what it is. What this will do is this will soak into the rod thread and prevent the epoxy from soaking into that rod thread. And what this will do is this will allow you to make sure that if you have a certain color thread and you want that color to really stand out after it's covered with epoxy, it's pretty critical that you use some color preservative. If you don't, then the epoxy is just going to soak all the way into those wraps, and in most cases you end up losing the original color of the thread and it becomes very, very dark. Some people like doing it that way. Some people believe that applying color preservative and preventing that epoxy from soaking into the wraps makes for a weaker wrap. Well, depending on how much epoxy you're putting on and how far you extend off of the wraps onto the blank, you still have a good, solid epoxy job, even if you're using color preservative. I suppose it's just a matter of personal preference. We have a small pair of very sharp scissors. We'll use these for trimming of some thread. There's a couple of steps in the process where you might want to use a little bit of crazy glue. And what we have is some crazy glue that I use when I'm tying my own flies. It's called Zap-A-Gap, and it's very, very thick, but it's essentially just like any other crazy glue. In addition, we have some denatured alcohol and some relatively lint-free paper towels. It's really important to have something on hand that you can get to very quickly if you make a mess out of your epoxy, so that you can clean that off before it begins drying. Something else that I use, it's not totally necessary that you have one, is a pair of calipers. These are handy for measuring the diameter of a rod blank for fitting certain components such as a winding check, for instance. You'll be surprised at just how much masking tape you use while you're building a fishing rod, in particular a fly rod. I have a couple different widths here, 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. This is really handy. We'll be using this for holding things in place temporarily until we can either glue them or wrap some thread onto them. I also have some Exacto knives, just some hobbyist knives here. You'll be surprised at how handy it will be to have some different types of blades on hand, but make sure that they're sharp. Don't use old blades for any step in this process. For mixing up our epoxy, we have just some basic brushes and some measuring cups with graduated marks in here to help us make sure that we're getting a good 50-50 mixture of both 5-minute epoxy and the actual guide, the guide epoxy that we'll be using. We have some stir sticks that are non-porous plastic. We don't want to leave any particles in there, so we don't want to use any kind of wood or anything like that when we're mixing up our epoxy. Lastly, we have a really handy tool. It's a China marker, and this is really handy for making temporary marks on your fly rod, such as when you're trying to find the spine of a fly rod, or if you want to temporarily mark where you'll be putting a certain guide on the rod blank. And this, you just scrape this off with your thumbnail when you're done. So this is really handy. That's all it requires for building your own fly rod. Not a whole lot of specialty tools here. You can get really fancy with a rod wrapper, or you can, you can sit in a chair and put the thread in a can behind your back and run the thread up from between your legs, so that the weight of your own body puts some tension on that thread, and you could be wrapping that rod blank across your knees if you want, but you might be a little frustrated with that. So at the very least, we just have a very basic rod wrapper here that you can make yourself. If you don't have a thread tensioner, well, you could use a really thick book and slap that thread down and close the book and use that book to provide a little bit of thread tension. But this manual rod wrapper here should be considered kind of your first rod building tool.